During a heated live TV interview, an arrogant journalist tried to corner Ibrahim Traore with tough and condescending questions. But no one anticipated what would come next. Traore's calm and confident response not only dismantled the journalist's argument but also left the entire studio in stunned silence. This unforgettable moment quickly went viral, showcasing his poise, intelligence, and unwavering sense of leadership. The studio lights were blazing, the cameras were rolling, and the host, Alan Diaro, a sharp-tongued journalist known for ambushing his guests, leaned forward with a smirk. Across from him sat a composed man in a simple military uniform. No guards, no entourage, just him. President Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso's transitional leader. Alan wasted no time. "Mr. Traore," he began, his voice as sharp as a knife, "how does a man with no formal political background lead a country torn by terrorism and poverty?" There was a pause, and a thick silence settled over the room. Producers behind the scenes exchanged glances. Alan wasn't done. He chuckled and added, "Some say you're just playing soldier in a real man's game. What do you say to that?" A hush fell over the room. One assistant dropped her clipboard, another turned off her mic and whispered, "This is going too far." But President Traore didn't flinch. He met Alan's gaze directly, not with anger, but with strength. Slowly, he said, "Do you ask those who bleed for their people to prove their worth? Or do you stand with them and ask what you can give?" The room held its breath. That was only the beginning. As the camera zoomed in on Ibrahim's face, across the city, a boy named Karim sat cross-legged in a dusty living room. He was 10 years old, wearing a shirt too big for him, the collar torn. Beside him, his grandmother coughed softly. She had been sick for months. The TV flickered. The signal wasn't great, but the boy's eyes were locked on the screen. He didn't understand politics. He didn't even know who the man in the uniform was. But something in Ibrahim's voice felt kind, like a father, like someone who had also slept on the floor, like someone who understood. Back at the studio, Alan leaned forward again. "You talk about sacrifice, Mr. President, but are you willing to admit that your government has failed in areas where others warned you?" Karim's small hands clenched into fists. He whispered, "Let him talk. Just let him talk." On the screen, Traore smiled gently. "I didn't come here to prove perfection," he said. "I came to serve, even when it hurts, especially when it hurts." Karim blinked. He had never heard a leader say something like that before. In that moment, he felt hope. In the control room above the studio, a producer named Lucy was sweating. She had booked this interview to boost ratings, to make noise, to catch Traore off guard. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected dignity. As Ibrahim answered the next hard-hitting question with grace, her hand trembled on the control board. Then, without warning, a call came through the direct line. It was from the office of the Prime Minister. Her heart dropped. "Do not cut the feed." The voice ordered, "Let the people hear him. Let the truth speak." Back on stage, Alan threw one more punch. "Tell us, Mr. President, why should we believe that you, a man with no political dynasty, no elite background, can lead this country?" The camera zoomed in and Traore's voice came like a river, strong, calm, unstoppable. "Because I was that boy who sold mangoes to pay school fees. Because I still walk where others drive. And because power to me is not a crown, it is a burden, and I carry it for them." Lucy wiped her eyes. She wasn't sure why she was crying, but she knew something historic was unfolding. Backstage, a junior intern named Adama was shaking. It was his first week at the station, and he had been assigned to refill water for the guests. But instead of standing by the water table, he found himself stuck in the shadows behind the curtain. He had never seen the president this close, not with armed guards or loud speeches, just a man answering questions calmly, kindly, like someone who understood pain. Adama's own father, a soldier, had died last year fighting terrorists in the north. Since then, he had grown to hate anything connected to the military. But as he watched Ibrahim Traore speak about carrying burdens for the people, something inside him cracked. This wasn't a man chasing power. This was a man standing alone. "On behalf of millions, I see your medals," the journalist sneered from the stage. "But do medals feed our people?" Traore didn't blink. He spoke softly. No, they don't. But the sacrifices behind them protect the people who do the feeding. Adama gasped for the first time since his father's funeral. He smiled and whispered to himself, Papa would have followed this man. Back in a small living room on the outskirts of Bob Dulasso, Karim was crying. Not loud sobs, just silent tears, the kind that fall when a boy understands something too big for his heart. His grandmother had fallen asleep beside him, her breathing shallow and weak. On the screen, the man who looked like a warrior but spoke like a teacher was still speaking. The journalist raised his voice again. What makes you think you know what's best for this country? Traoré paused, then answered, Because I've slept in the rain. I've taught children with no shoes. I've buried friends without coffins. I know pain, I know hunger, and I've seen hope in the darkest places. Karim's chest ached. He remembered being chased from school because he hadn't paid his fees. He remembered crying into his grandmother's arms that night. And now, this man, this president, was speaking for boys like him. He grabbed his school notebook and began to draw the face he saw on TV. One word beneath the sketch, hope. In the control booth, Lucy watched the rising view count. 400, 530,000, 780,000, the numbers were exploding. She had expected a scandal, a stumble, a live humiliation. Instead, the world was watching a masterclass in humility. Alan, the journalist, grew more agitated. His questions now were sharp, clearly desperate. But isn't it true, he barked, that some say your leadership is just a military stunt? Traoré smiled gently. There are people who use uniforms to control, and there are people who use them to protect. I chose the second. For the first time, the audience in the studio clapped. Alan froze. That wasn't part of the script. Lucy's assistant leaned close and whispered, Should we cut the feed? Lucy didn't answer. She couldn't. Tears quietly rolled down her cheek. Her father had once called her from the battlefield, whispering a goodbye before his final mission. She had buried that memory for years. But now, this man on TV, he was bringing her father's voice back. Not with words, but with truth. And that truth was shattering everything. As the cameras rolled, a silence filled the studio. Not the awkward kind, the kind you cut with fake laughter. This silence was deep, heavy, like a heartbeat holding its breath. Alan, the journalist, had just asked a cruel question. Do you ever feel guilty sitting in power while mothers bury their sons? Even the crew flinched, but Traoré didn't react with anger. He simply looked up and said softly, Every single night. His voice cracked barely but enough to be felt. I write their names in my journal. I meet their families. I walk their villages. Power doesn't protect me from pain. It forces me to carry it. There was no clap, no cheer, just the weight of truth settling over everyone. Alan looked down at his papers, suddenly unsure of what to ask next. Backstage, Adama wiped his face. Again, realizing his hands were wet. The boy who once resented soldiers now saw them differently. Because for the first time, it felt like someone up there actually cared. I visited a camp in Kaya, Traoré said, adjusting his jacket, where I met a little girl named Aminata. The camera zoomed in, and the air turned cold. She was 7. She had lost her father to a rebel attack, her mother to illness. She was alone. Yet, she smiled. Alan raised an eyebrow. And what does that have to do with policy? Traoré looked at him, not with hate but sorrow. Everything, he replied. She told me, if I can smile, maybe others will too. That child reminded me that leadership is not about control. It's about healing. The room went still. Again, somewhere in the audience, a woman burst into tears. Her name was Kata. She had lost her son to a roadside bomb 3 years ago. She had stopped watching politics since then until today. Now, her heart was breaking all over again. But not from pain, from relief. Finally, someone who wasn't reading from a script. Finally, someone speaking from the soul. Back at the station's control room, the phones were ringing non-stop. Lucy's assistant shouted, We have calls from Mali, Ivory Coast, Ghana. Another voice yelled, France's airing clips already. Look at this. Traoré hadn't raised his voice once, but the world was listening. Alan, now sweating, tried one last time. If you truly loved the people, wouldn't you step down and let a civilian lead? The trap was clear, the bait bitter, but Traoré nodded. One day, yes, but not yet, because the house is on fire, and I am the one holding the hose. He leaned forward. When it's safe, I will leave, not for glory, but so the next leader can plant without fearing the flames. The cameraman whispered, Meyer. Alan sat back, speechless. Everyone in the studio felt it, the shift. This wasn't politics anymore. It was personal. In homes across Burkina Faso, fathers held sons closer, mothers reached for tissue boxes, and children stared at the screen with a new word on their lips, respect. As the nation leaned into their screens, a staff member handed Traoré a folded note, mid-interview. He read it silently, his eyes never blinking. Then he looked up at the camera and said, permission to share something. Alan nodded, unsure of what was coming. This is a letter, Traoré said, from Captain Sidby. He died yesterday in Djibo. He asked me to read this if anything ever happened to him. The studio fell quiet once more. Traoré's voice didn't shake. Moan President, if I die, please tell my son why I fought. Not for medals, not for power, but so he can one day play football without hearing gunshots. So he can go to school with both shoes. So he can smile. Traoré folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. Captain Sidby was 31. His wife was watching now, with their 3-year-old boy. The camera panned to Alan's pale face. In the control room, Lucy's hands trembled. Across the nation, people weren't just watching, they were feeling. Right before the break, Traoré surprised everyone. I'd like to invite someone, he said. Alan looked puzzled. Excuse me? Traoré pointed to the side curtain. Out walked a young woman in her 20s, wearing plain clothes but standing tall. This, Traoré said, is Fatima, a nurse. She's been working in a conflict zone hospital in Foden Gorma. Alone, the audience murmured. Fatima gave a shy wave and Traoré stepped aside. She spoke. I've stitched wounds with no anesthesia. I've comforted crying children with no family left. But I do it because our people, they matter. Her voice cracked. Last week, rebels attacked our clinic. I hid the babies under a table with my own body. If not for the army arriving, if not for President Traoré's efforts, they'd be gone. Alan couldn't speak. The audience sat frozen. The truth had entered the room, and it was wearing a nurse's smile. Outside the studio, hundreds were already gathering, holding candles, watching through windows. It was no longer just an interview. It was a movement. The station planned a commercial break, but Traoré leaned into his mic. 1 minute, he whispered to the host. The crew scrambled. He looked directly into the lens. My father was a farmer. My mother taught me how to read under a mango tree. We had no electricity, but we had love. That's what shaped me, not titles, not uniforms. He paused, then added, I don't pretend to be perfect, but I promise you every decision I make, I ask myself, would my mother be proud of this? Would that little boy in Djibo understand it? There were no spotlights now, just raw, heavy silence. Outside the building, the crowd began to softly sing the national anthem. Inside, Fatima held her hands over her mouth to hold back sobs. Adama, watching from a dusty tea shop, stood up without realizing it. Back in the studio, the cameras kept rolling because no one dared cut away. In less than 48 hours, the interview had become something else, a reckoning, a wake-up call, a mirror. The world wasn't ready for what Ibrahim Traore was becoming. Just when the cameras resumed, Traoré surprised everyone again. I received a message yesterday, he said gently, from a 12-year-old boy in the north. He pulled a folded page from his coat. His name is Yakuba. He reads slowly, letting every word settle. Dear Mr. President, I want to be brave like you. My father died when bandits came. My mother cries at night. I don't want toys. I just want to feel safe. Please don't give up on us. Double quotes YAKUBA. Alan single quotes S. Jaw tensed. He didn't dare speak. Traoré looked into the camera. I hear you, Yakuba, and I'm not giving up. In a dusty village, 600 kilometers away, Yakuba sat with his mother beside a neighbor's old radio. She wept quietly. The people in the studio were silent. The viewers were shaking. In that moment, it wasn't politics anymore. It was personal. And for many, It was the first time they saw a leader not as a figure on a podium, but as a father, a brother, a protector, one who listened. Alan finally spoke, his voice noticeably shaken. Softer, but Mr. President, isn't this emotional appeal just good theater? Isn't it easier to read letters than to build a country? There was a sharp silence. Traoré didn't blink. He stood, walked to the center of the studio, and sat on the floor. Barely anyone breathed. I've walked barefoot to school. I've eaten from one bowl with 10 cousins. My leadership doesn't come from books, it comes from pain. He pointed at the camera. If all you see is a man performing, then you've missed the point. This isn't about me. This is about what we owe to those who've lost everything. Even Alan lowered his eyes. Traoré's voice dropped. I'm not acting. I'm remembering. That line cut deep, not just through the room, but across the country. Veterans watching at home saluted. Mothers clutched their children. Even Alan's own producer wiped tears from her eyes. Still, the storm was only growing. That night, no one could sleep. By 9:01 p.m., the streets of Ouagadougou were filled with candles. No one had planned it. It just happened. People came out silently. Children held hands, old men carried flags, women stood with photos of lost loved ones. The whole capital was glowing not with fire, but with hope. A soft chant spread like wind. Nous sommes unis, nous sommes unis. Traoré watched from the window of his modest home. He turned to his aide and whispered, not a word from me. Let the people speak now. In a tiny hospital, Fatima placed her candle by a photo of Captain Sidbi in Jibo. Yakuba's mother hugged him tighter. And in the TV station, Alan sat alone, watching the replay of the interview on a small monitor. He paused the video at Traoré's final line. I'm not acting. I'm remembering. He stared. For the first time, he understood what real leadership looked like. But something unexpected was about to happen, something that would change everything forever. The air outside the station was tense. Word had spread like wildfire. The journalist who had tried to humiliate President Ibrahim Traoré had vanished from public view. For 2 days, Alan Diarra, once celebrated for his sharp tongue and bold questions, was now a man at war with himself. Inside his apartment, unshaven and unsteady, he stared at the replay of the interview for the 100th time. Every line he asked, every smirk, every attempt to corner Traoré now sounded cruel. But what broke him most was the president's poise. He had responded not with anger, but with calm truths. Alan turned to his window and watched 2 children walking barefoot down the dusty street, laughing with nothing in their hands but a stick and a dream. He remembered a time when he was like them, when he wanted to use his voice to defend the voiceless, not humiliate those who served them. He collapsed onto the floor and wept. And then he stood. He knew what he had to do, something bigger than an apology, something the world would never forget. Alan requested airtime the next morning. The station resisted at first, but when they saw the look in his eyes, they agreed. He stepped into the same studio, same chair, same camera. This time, he wore no suit, just a simple shirt and a humble face. And when the red light blinked on, he looked straight into the camera, not with arrogance, but with trembling honesty. I failed all of you, he began. I tried to corner a man who has given his life to protecting our people. I used my voice to divide instead of unite. He paused, eyes wet. But President Traoré showed me and showed the world what leadership really looks like. He stood firm, not for himself, but for every Burkinabe child, mother, and soldier. That is the man I now admire. There was silence across the country. Then cheers, then tears, and then a door opened. Traoré walked in, unexpected, uninvited, but welcome. He placed a hand on Alan's shoulder. This is how nations heal, he said. That evening, Traoré didn't go to a palace or a high-level meeting. He walked through the streets of Ouagadougou with Alan beside him. No cameras, no bodyguards. At a small village on the outskirts, a group of young boys gathered around him, barefoot, playing with sticks. One boy ran up to him and asked, "Are you the man on TV?" Traoré smiled. "I am, but more importantly, I'm your servant." The boy tilted his head. "You serve people." Traoré knelt beside him. Every real leader does. That moment, captured by a single bystander's phone, went viral across Africa. It showed Traoré holding the boy's hand and walking him home. That week ended with no grand speeches, no fireworks, just the memory of humility, redemption, and unity. And from that day, Burkina Faso remembered not the argument, but the healing. Not the question, but the answer. Did this story move you? Did you cry? Did your heart feel something deep? Then don't leave without showing it. Like this video to spread the message of humility and leadership. Comment "I believe in hope" if you felt the power of truth and unity. Subscribe now if you want more real-life emotional stories that change lives and maybe even nations. Let's remind the world, sometimes, the strongest voice is the one that speaks calmly, and the greatest power is love for your people.